I was born in the lower industrial levels of Hive Tertius, on a world whose designation I learned only later. Salvation's Edge. The name would prove grimly appropriate. My earliest memory is thermal rather than visual. The heat from the foundry vents, precisely 43 degrees at floor level where children could sit without burning, radiating through the rockcrete in waves that made the air shimmer. We would press our backs against the warm stone during sleep cycle, because blankets were rationed and winter came hard even 7 levels below ground. My mother worked the promethium distribution valves on the 19th shift rotation. I remember her hands. Specific detail. The burn scars formed precise geometric patterns across her palms where hot metal had kissed flesh repeatedly over years of service. She would return each cycle smelling of chemical residue and machine oil, a scent I found comforting because it meant she had returned at all. The distribution sector had a mortality rate the overseers posted quarterly. 14% annual attrition. She survived 6 years. I was 9 when the explosion took her processing station and 47 others. I was recruited into the mining corps at age 10, the standard age for orphans of industrial casualties. They gave me a designation, Labor Unit 7743. M, Subdivision Tunneling Operations. The M denoted male. The subdivision denoted my life expectancy, though I did not understand that yet. Tunneling crews lived an average of 4.3 years before cave-ins, equipment failures, or atmosphere breaches removed them from the census data. I learned to operate a las cutter within 6 days. I learned to recognize the sound of unstable rock within 2 weeks. The sound was a specific frequency, a grinding that registered at the edge of hearing, accompanied by dust falling in patterns that indicated fracture propagation. The place where everything changed was Tunnel Complex 7, approximately 3 kilometers below the hive's foundation, in a region the geological surveys had marked as stable sedimentary layers. We were expanding the water reclamation network, cutting through stone that had not seen light since this world formed. I was 14. The last cutter in my hands had been manufactured on some distant forge world and shipped here in a container with 10,000 identical units. It bore the Mechanicus seal and operated at a frequency that made my teeth vibrate. The wall opened differently than stone should open. I had cut through 17 meters of rock that shift. The last beam carved as it always carved, superheating stone into vapor and slag. But when the wall fell away, there was a cavity behind it. Natural caverns were not uncommon in deep tunnel work. We were trained to report them, seal them, reroute the excavation. Standard protocol. But this cavity was not natural. The walls were too smooth, the angles too precise, and there was something inside. I will describe what I saw with the specificity the moment deserves. The chamber measured approximately 40 meters in diameter, roughly circular, with walls that curved in a way that suggested biological growth rather than geological formation. The temperature inside was 6 degrees warmer than the tunnel, with humidity elevated to 73%. There was a smell. Not decay exactly, but something organic in suspended animation. And in the center of the chamber, in a depression that formed a perfect circle, there were eggs. I did not know they were eggs then. They appeared as organic pods, each perhaps half a meter in height, with surfaces that glistened with moisture despite the sealed environment. There were 19 of them, I counted. They were arranged in a pattern that would later be explained to me as a sacred geometry, though in that moment I knew only that I was looking at something the Imperium had not placed here. Something that predated our tunnels and our hive, and perhaps our presence on this world entirely. The Overseer was summoned. He arrived within 20 minutes, which was unusually fast response time for someone of his rank to descend to working depth. He studied the chamber for 70 seconds. I timed it by counting my heartbeats, a habit I had developed to manage fear during cave-ins. Then he ordered the site sealed, and all workers transferred to different shifts. Standard contamination protocol, he said. We would be monitored for atmospheric toxins and reassigned once medical clearance processed. The medical examination occurred in a facility I had never accessed before, deep in the hive's infrastructure where the air tasted of recycled breath and old machinery. The medic who examined me was thorough. Blood samples, genetic sequencing, neurological scans. He spent considerable time examining my eyes, using an augmetic scanner that hurt to look at directly. When he finished, he marked my file with a notation I could not read from my position on the examination slab. He told me I was cleared for reassignment. He told me to report to a new facility designation. The facility was a chapel. I had been raised in the Imperial Creed, as all citizens are raised, with prayers before shift and benedictions after, with the Emperor's watchful presence, a constant background radiation of faith. But I had never been inside a chapel proper. The labor districts had shrines, small alcoves where the ministerium maintained icons and incense, but actual chapels were for higher hab levels, for citizens whose work did not coat them in stone dust and chemical residue. This chapel was different. It existed in the industrial bowels like we did, carved into spaces between support columns, lit by luminators that flickered with uncertain power. And it was full. Perhaps 200 individuals occupied the space, all standing, all silent. They watched me enter with expressions I could not immediately pass. Not hostility, not welcome exactly. Recognition. The man who approached me moved with authority, despite wearing the same industrial garments as the rest of us. He was older, perhaps 40, with features that seemed familiar in a way I could not articulate. Later, I would understand why. The genetic markers were already expressing. He placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that would have been overfamiliar from a stranger, but his touch carried something that bypassed my discomfort. Warmth. Connection. A sense of belonging I had not felt since my mother stopped returning from her shift. He told me his name was Magnus, not a rank, not a designation. A name, he told me, I had been chosen. He told me I was family. He told me the star gods had marked me before I was born, that I carried their blessing in my blood, that the thing I had discovered in the tunnel was not accident, but destiny. He told me I was home. I believed him. That was my beginning. Age 14, standing in an illegal chapel 3 kilometers below the hive proper, being welcomed into something I did not understand by people who looked at me like I mattered. The Imperium had given me a designation and a 4-year life expectancy. These people gave me a name, not the name my mother used, which had been discarded when I became a labor unit, but a new name that marked me as theirs. They called me brother, and I, who had been alone since age 9, accepted that name like a drowning man accepts air. The education began immediately. I was not removed from my labor assignment. That would have drawn attention, but my off-shift hours were no longer spent in the communal sleeping halls. I was brought to chambers I had not known existed, spaces carved into the hive's forgotten architecture, where the cult maintained its hidden infrastructure. They taught me the true history, not the lies the Imperium fed to workers, but the real purpose of our existence. They taught me about the star gods, about beings who traveled between worlds in the great dark, whose hunger was holy, whose arrival would bring transformation. They taught me that humanity as it existed was merely a chrysalis stage, that we were meant to evolve beyond our limited flesh into something greater. They showed me texts, not the Lectitio Divinitatis, but older scriptures written in languages that hurt to read, symbols that seemed to move when I was not looking directly at them. They showed me the Patriarch. The chamber where he resided was deep, deeper than the tunnels I had excavated, in spaces that must have been ancient when the hive was new. The air there was warm and wet, difficult to breathe until my lungs adjusted. The Patriarch himself was massive, perhaps 4 meters in length, with 4 arms that ended in claws of chitin and bone. His head was elongated, eyeless but seeing, with sensory organs that tracked movement through means I could not comprehend. When I entered his presence, I felt something touch my mind, not words, not images exactly. Pure meaning poured directly into consciousness. Welcome, child. You are known. You are loved. You are chosen. I wept. I had not wept since my mother died. But in that moment, feeling the Patriarch's attention focused on me with absolute certainty of my value, I could not contain the response. This was what faith was supposed to feel like. Not the cold recitation of imperial catechisms, not the distant emperor who required everything and provided nothing. This was immediate, this was real, this was love. I learned later that I was fourth generation. My mother had been third generation, her hybrid nature subtle enough to pass imperial genetic screening, working her entire life in the hive's infrastructure while carrying the star god's gift in her cells. She had known what I was before I was born. The geometric scars on her hands were not from industrial accidents, but from sacred rituals I would eventually understand. She had died before she could bring me into the family properly, but the family had found me anyway. They always did. We were drawn to each other through bonds deeper than conscious thought. The cult's structure revealed itself gradually. Magnus was Primus, military commander and the Patriarch's right hand. Beneath him were the neophytes like myself, workers and soldiers who appeared fully human but carried the gift in hidden ways. Above us, in purity, were the second and third generation hybrids. Those whose transformation was more visible, but who served in roles where their altered physiology provided advantage. And at the pinnacle, the pure-strain Genestealers, the Patriarch's direct offspring, perfect expressions of what we would all eventually become. My training intensified. Physical conditioning to maximize the advantages my altered genetics provided. I was stronger than baseline humans, faster, more resilient. My reflexes operated at speeds that felt like precognition. In combat drills, I could track and respond to threats before my conscious mind registered them. They taught me to fight with the cult's favored weapons, autoguns and mining charges adapted into demolitions, las cutters modified into las weapons that could cut through armor as easily as stone. But the most important training was spiritual. They taught me to open my mind to the brood mind, the psychic network that connected all of us through the Patriarch's consciousness. It felt like learning to hear a frequency that had always existed, but which I had been deaf to. At first it was overwhelming, hundreds of minds touching mine simultaneously, thoughts and emotions bleeding together into chaos. But gradually I learned to navigate the network, to distinguish individual consciousnesses while remaining connected to the whole. The brood mind was everything the Imperium pretended to be, but was not. True unity. Shared purpose, no individual stood alone, because we were all extensions of the same greater being. When my brothers and sisters died in the industrial accidents that claimed so many, I felt their deaths through the network, their consciousness dissolving back into the whole. There was grief, but also certainty. They had served, they mattered. The Patriarch remembered them, and therefore they were not truly lost. I met Kale during weapons training in my 16th year. He was 2 years older, third generation, with features that marked him as other if examined too closely. His eyes were too large, set slightly too far apart. His hands had 6 fingers instead of 5, the extra digits fully functional, and adding precision to his grip. In a hive city of billions, these differences made him nearly invisible, another mutant worker in the industrial depths where mutation was common from chemical exposure and radiation. He moved like water. That was the first thing I noticed. During close combat drills, while I relied on enhanced strength and speed, Kale flowed around attacks with economy of motion that suggested he perceived combat in dimensions I was only beginning to understand. When he struck, it was with 4 limbs simultaneously, his extra fingers allowing weapon manipulation that should have been impossible. He disarmed me 17 times in our first sparring session. I learned more from those 17 failures than from months of prior training. We were assigned to the same insurgency cell, a unit of 12 neophytes and acolytes tasked with preparing the hive's infrastructure for eventual uprising. Our missions were small, incremental. Sabotaging industrial equipment to create supply disruptions, placing monitoring devices in administrative centers to track imperial response patterns, recruiting new members from the desperate and disenfranchised who filled the lower hive in endless supply. Kale taught me to think strategically. Where I saw individual operations, he saw the pattern. Each act of sabotage was a data point in a larger calculation. The Imperium's response times, the flexibility of their supply chains, the breaking points of their social control mechanisms. We were not fighting yet. We were testing, learning, preparing for a war that would come when the time was right. The time was determined by factors beyond our direct control. The cult had existed for 4 generations, approximately 130 years by my calculation. The patriarch was patient. The plan was generational. Each wave of new births expanded our numbers geometrically. My mother's generation had counted in the hundreds. My generation counted in the thousands. The next generation would count in the tens of thousands. And when we reached critical mass, when our numbers sufficed and our preparations completed, we would send the signal. The signal would call them our true parents, the star gods who traveled between worlds in the great dark. They would come, and they would deliver us from the Imperium's machinery of suffering. No more labor quotas, no more children orphaned by industrial accidents, no more lives measured in production output and mortality statistics. We would be transformed, uplifted, made part of something greater than this grinding existence. I asked Kale once if he was afraid. We were in a supply tunnel, placing charges that would collapse a transport junction during the uprising. It was quiet work, technical, requiring precision to ensure the blast would create maximum disruption without premature detonation. He had 6 fingers on the detonator, adjusting timing sequences with minute precision. He said fear was irrelevant. We were already dead by Imperial standards. Labor units with 4-year expectancies, workers in zones where atmospheric toxins and industrial accidents removed thousands per cycle. The question was not whether we would die, but whether our deaths would mean anything. The cult offered meaning, purpose, the certainty that our suffering would birth something better. I accepted his answer. It made sense within the framework we inhabited. But I noticed he did not say he was unafraid. He said fear was irrelevant, which was not the same thing. The uprising was triggered in my 18th year, not by our choice, but by discovery. Imperial authorities raided a cult safehouse in the mid-hive commercial sector, the action itself unremarkable in a city where dissent was routine and suppression constant. But the raiders found documents they should not have found, communication codes that revealed the scope of our network. The broodmind lit with alarm. The Primus made the calculation in real time. If we waited for Imperial response to develop, we would be hunted piece by piece, our generations of preparation dismantled by systematic purges. We struck first. The coordinated assault began at hour 0 of night cycle, when shift changes created maximum confusion and minimal oversight. Across 17 hive sectors simultaneously, cult forces emerged from concealment and seized critical infrastructure. Power generation facilities, water reclamation plants, transportation hubs, communications arrays. We had spent years mapping these targets, identifying the precise points where damage would cascade through Imperial control systems. I was assigned to the Generatorium complex in Lower Industrial, a facility that powered 15 hive sectors and employed 8,000 workers. Our cell numbered 50 neophytes and 12 acolyte hybrids. We went in through maintenance access points, moving through spaces we had worked in for years, past security systems we had subverted months prior. The resistance was minimal. Most workers were cult members themselves, 4th generation like me, who simply stopped working and picked up weapons when the moment came. The enforcers responded within 40 minutes. I recorded the timestamp because it mattered. 40 minutes to organize a response, deploy forces, and breach our perimeter. Slower than optimal Imperial response time, suggesting our preliminary sabotage had degraded their coordination. They came in force, riot shields and shock malls, expecting to suppress another industrial uprising with standard protocols. They were not prepared for what we had become. Kale led the defense of the eastern approach, moving through the Generatorium's machinery with 12 acolytes who had spent their lives learning every angle and shadow. The enforcers entered a kill zone without recognizing it. Last fire came from 17 positions simultaneously, coordinated through the brood mind with precision no Vox network could match. I witnessed the enforcers' formation collapse in under 30 seconds. They retreated, leaving 19 dead. We lost 3 neophytes. I felt their deaths through the brood mind, consciousness fragmenting and dissolving. I logged their names for remembrance and continued firing. The pattern repeated across the hive. Cult forces seized and held. Imperial forces responded and died. Within 6 hours, we controlled 40% of critical infrastructure. Within 12 hours, we had issued demands to the hive's governor. Not negotiable demands, ultimatums. Surrender or watch the hive tear itself apart from within. The governor's response was orbital bombardment of the sectors we held. They calculated that destroying 15% of the hive was acceptable cost to eliminate insurgent forces. Approximately 400,000 casualties. The numbers appeared on data screens in the Generatorium's control room, broadcast by the governor himself. A demonstration of imperial resolve. They would burn their own cities rather than yield control. But they could not burn what they could not target. We had prepared for this. The cult's forces dispersed into the hive's deep infrastructure, into tunnels and forgotten spaces where orbital strikes could not reach. We abandoned fixed positions and became phantoms, striking and vanishing, bleeding the Imperium through 1,000 small wounds. The brood mind coordinated our movements. When Imperial forces concentrated to crush one cell, 6 others struck undefended positions. They could not predict us because we did not communicate through channels they could intercept. We were one organism with 10,000 bodies, and we were winning. The Patriarch spoke to us through the brood mind during the 3rd week of fighting. His consciousness filled us, massive and certain, carrying meaning that transcended words. Victory was approaching. The signal would be sent. Our true parents were coming. We needed to hold for 30 more days, to maintain control of the signal arrays long enough to broadcast the psychic summons that would call the star gods across the void. 30 days. I could sustain anything for 30 days. Kale died on day 23. We were holding a Vox relay station in the mid-hive when the Adeptus Arbites deployed. Not enforcers this time, but actual Arbites, the Imperium's judges and executioners, armored in carapace and carrying suppression shields that could withstand our last fire. They came in disciplined formation, advancing through our kill zones with coordinated fire that suppressed our positions and forced us into close quarters. Kale recognized the tactical shift before I did. He ordered the cell to fall back while he and 4 acolytes held the choke point, buying time for our retreat. Standard sacrifice play. I moved toward the fallback position because orders existed for reason. But I maintained visual contact through a shattered viewport, watching as Kale engaged the Arbite's line, with all 6 fingers on his weapons, firing and reloading in patterns too fast for baseline humans to match. He killed 7 before they adapted. I counted. 7 Arbites dropped with precision shots to helmet seals and armor joints, targeting weak points with the skill I had watched him develop over years. Then the Arbites deployed flamers. The Promethean stream caught Kale and his squad in a corridor with no lateral exit. I watched them burn. I felt through the brood mind as his consciousness registered the fire, the pain, the realization that he was dying. I felt him reach out across the psychic network, not for help because help was impossible, but to affirm connection one final time. To be witnessed, to be remembered. His last thought before the fire consumed his brain was satisfaction. He had bought us 47 seconds. 47 seconds for 30 neophytes to reach fallback positions and survive. The tactical objective achieved. The sacrifice meaningful. I archived this. I logged the timestamp and his final measurement of success. Then I continued moving, because that was what he had died to enable. The grief came later, in a maintenance tunnel 4 kilometers distant, when I had time to process that the mind I had trained aside and trusted completely was no longer accessible through the brood mind. There was an absence where Kale had existed. The network adjusted, redistributing connections, but the absence remained, would always remain. I had lost brothers and sisters throughout the uprising, dozens whose names I knew and whose consciousness I had touched. But Kale was different. He had been the one who taught me to see beyond individual actions to systemic patterns. The one whose presence in the brood mind felt like steady ground beneath uncertain steps. The first person besides my mother whose death felt like amputation rather than loss. I continued. We all continued. That was the nature of what we had become. Individual grief dissolved into collective purpose. Kale's death meant nothing if we failed. It meant everything if we succeeded. So we succeeded. We held the signal arrays for the 30 days the Patriarch required. And on day 31, the psychic summons screamed into the void with power that made the brood mind burn with ecstatic certainty. They heard us. Across the impossible distance of space, across light years of emptiness, the star gods heard their children calling. And they came. The first sign was astronomical. Observatories across the hive detected gravitational anomalies at the system's edge, massive objects translating from warp space into reality. The Imperial Navy responded immediately, deploying every vessel in system to intercept, but their numbers were insufficient. What emerged from the warp was not a fleet, but a living tide. Thousands of bioships, each the size of a frigate or larger, moving with coordinated purpose that no mechanical fleet could match. The Hive Fleet had arrived. We felt it through the brood mind before any official announcement. The Patriarch's consciousness swelled with recognition and triumph. Our parents had come. The star gods were here to deliver us from suffering, to transform us into something greater, to reward our generations of faithful service. The uprising shifted from desperate survival to celebration. We had won. Against the Imperium's full weight, we had succeeded. The transformation was beginning. The naval battle lasted 6 days. We monitored reports through captured Vox channels, listening as Imperial vessels engaged the bioships in void combat. The Navy fought with everything it possessed, lance strikes and torpedoes, bomber wings and broadside batteries. They destroyed hundreds of bioships. It was not enough. For every vessel they killed, 10 more pressed forward. The bioships did not maneuver like human ships, bound by momentum and thrust. They moved like predators, adapting in real time to Imperial tactics, learning from each engagement. On day 6, the Hive Fleet broke through the orbital defenses. Bioships entered atmospheric approach vectors, their living hulls superheating as they descended. They did not crash, they landed. Across 17 continents, across hive cities and industrial complexes and agrozones, the star gods made planetfall. We went to meet them. The cult's forces emerged from the hive's deep infrastructure in their entirety. 50,000 neophytes and acolytes and hybrids, carrying the weapons we had fought with and the faith we had killed for. We marched through streets the Imperium could no longer hold, past abandoned enforcer stations and collapsed government buildings, toward the landing sites where our parents had arrived. I marched with my cell through the industrial sectors where I had been born, past the foundry where my mother had died, past the tunnel where I had discovered the eggs that had changed everything. I carried the autogun Kale had trained me with, though I no longer needed to fire it. The Imperium had collapsed. Their forces were retreating to orbital evacuation points or dying in the streets. The hive belonged to us. The world belonged to us. And soon, we would belong to something greater. The first bioship I saw directly measured approximately 800 meters in length, a living construct of chitin and flesh that had embedded itself in the hive's upper spire. Its surface moved with constant motion, smaller organisms crawling across its hull, performing functions I could not immediately identify. There were orifices along its flanks, openings that dilated and contracted, expelling organisms into the city below. The organisms were not what I expected. I had anticipated that the star gods would appear as the patriarch appeared, magnificent and powerful and clearly meant for worship. But what emerged from the bioship were creatures built for consumption. They moved on multiple limbs, ranging in size from as small as a child to larger than industrial haulers. Their bodies were armored in thick carapace, with blade limbs and crushing claws. Their heads were eyeless but seeing, with sensory organs that tracked movement across vast distances. They moved with coordinated purpose, spreading through the hive in a tide that nothing could stop. They began eating immediately. Not the Imperium's forces, not the structures we had fought to capture. They ate everything. I watched from an elevated position as the first wave of creatures descended on an abandoned hab block. They tore into the structure with claws that could rend rockcrete, pulling apart walls to expose the infrastructure within. Then they consumed it. Metal, stone, plascrete, all of it broken down and absorbed into bodies that seemed to expand with each intake. Through the broodmind, the patriarch's voice carried reassurance. This was necessary. The star gods required biomass to complete the transformation. They would consume the world's material resources, break them down to base components, and from that raw material build our new existence. We needed to trust. We needed to maintain faith. We trusted. 50,000 cultists stood in celebration as the Hive Fleet consumed Salvation's Edge. We sang hymns in languages that hurt to speak. We opened our minds fully to the broodmind, sharing in the patriarch's joy at our parents' arrival. We had succeeded beyond all expectation. We had delivered an entire world. The creatures reached our position on the second day. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, flowing around obstacles with coordinated purpose. Thousands of them, ranging from small organisms the size of rats to massive creatures that stood 4 meters tall at the shoulder. They moved through the streets we occupied, around and between us, and they continued eating. Buildings, vehicles, equipment we had abandoned. Everything disappeared into their endless consumption. Magnus, the Primus who had first welcomed me into the family, stood at the forefront of our gathering. He raised his arms in greeting as the creatures approached. He spoke through the broodmind, his consciousness radiating certainty. We were about to be transformed. The star gods would recognize us as their children. We would be uplifted into the new existence we had fought generations to achieve. The first creature to reach Magnus was a mid-sized organism, perhaps 3 meters in length, moving on 6 legs with blade limbs held ready. It approached him directly, its eyeless head tracking his position with precision. Magnus did not move, did not raise weapons. He opened his arms wider, presenting himself for recognition, for transformation, for reward. The creature killed him in under 2 seconds. Blade limbs punched through his chest and abdomen, lifting him off the ground. Then it began feeding, tearing flesh from bone with mandibles that worked with mechanical efficiency. Magnus died without understanding. His consciousness in the broodmind registered shock, then confusion, then nothing. The creature dropped his body and moved toward the next cultist in line. The pattern repeated. Not transformation. Consumption. The creatures did not recognize us as different from any other biomass. We were food, components to be broken down and absorbed. Our generations of faith, our decades of preparation, our certain knowledge that we were chosen, none of it mattered. The star gods did not distinguish between loyal children and enemy forces. There was only biomass to be consumed. The cultists broke. 50,000 voices screaming betrayal through both physical space and the broodmind. Some ran, trying to reach shelter that no longer existed because the creatures had already consumed most of the hive structure. Some fought, firing weapons at creatures that had been meant as our parents. Some stood frozen, unable to process the fundamental collapse of everything they believed. I ran. Not from cowardice, though later I would recognize no shame and fear. I ran because my mind could not immediately process what was occurring, and when processing fails, the body defaults to survival protocols. I moved through the streets I had known my entire life, streets now being consumed by the tide of creatures. and I tried to understand. The fourth-generation hybrids died first. Those of us who appeared most human, who had served as the cult's infiltrators and warriors, were consumed without hesitation. The creatures did not pause to recognize the genetic markers we carried. They killed and fed and moved to the next target with efficiency that suggested we were not even worthy of consideration. The third-generation hybrids died slower. Their more obvious mutations caused brief hesitation in some creatures, a momentary assessment before the killing continued. But hesitation was not recognition. It was calculation of biomass value. The creatures killed them too. The second-generation hybrids, those whose bodies had transformed more completely toward the Genestealer form, were sometimes bypassed, not protected, simply ignored as the creatures moved toward more optimal food sources. They stood among the consumption, watching their children and grandchildren die, and they did not understand either. I found shelter in the deep tunnels where I had once excavated stone. The creatures had not reached that depth yet. They were consuming from the surface downward, methodically stripping the hive level by level. I had time, perhaps days, perhaps only hours. Time to process. The brood mind was chaos. 50,000 minds screaming in betrayal, confusion, and death. The Patriarch's consciousness tried to impose order, tried to maintain certainty that this was part of the plan, that transformation would come after consumption. But his certainty was fracturing. I felt it. We all felt it. Even the Patriarch, who had lived for over a century in absolute faith, was beginning to understand. We were not children. We were tools. The Genestealers were vanguard organisms, biological mechanisms designed to infiltrate prey populations, compromise their defenses, and summon the hive fleet. We had served our purpose. We had delivered the planet. And now we were being recycled along with everything else. I thought about Kale, about his death buying 47 seconds for 30 people to survive. I thought about my mother, working herself to death in the Prometheum distribution sector, while carrying the genetic gift she believed would save her son. I thought about Magnus, arms spread wide in greeting as blades punched through his chest. I thought about 4 generations of faithful service, of families binding themselves to something greater, of children born into certainty of purpose, all of it for this: to be food, to be components, to be broken down into base biological material and reformed into more creatures to consume more worlds. I existed in the tunnel for 3 days before they reached my depth. I spent that time attempting to access the brood mind, monitoring the dissolution of everything we had built. The Patriarch's consciousness remained, broadcasting reassurance that became increasingly hollow as his own transformation approached. The cult's numbers decreased hour by hour, 50,000 becoming 40,000, becoming 30,000. Each death registered as absence in the network, empty spaces where minds had existed. On the 3rd day, I felt the Patriarch die. His consciousness, massive and certain for over a century, fragmented and dispersed. I do not know if the creatures killed him or if the hive fleet absorbed him directly. The result was the same. The center of our faith, the anchor of our collective being, ceased to exist. The brood mind collapsed. 50,000 minds suddenly alone, disconnected, experiencing individuality for the first time in their lives. The silence was worse than the dying had been. I heard them approach my tunnel through vibration in the rock, the specific frequency of multiple limbs moving through stone, of claws finding purchase, of biomass descending. They came from above and below simultaneously, moving through spaces I had thought secure. I raised my autogun and aimed at the first creature to enter visual range. Then I lowered it. Not from acceptance, not from faith restored, from recognition of futility. The autogun held 30 rounds. There were hundreds of creatures in the tunnel system, thousands above me, millions across the planet. Shooting would accomplish nothing except alerting them to prioritize my position. I waited. They flowed past me in the darkness, moving toward surface levels where more biomass remained. They did not attack immediately because I was not optimal target. I was a lone, isolated, minimal biomass value compared to the surface populations they were still consuming. I was background priority. I would be processed eventually, but eventually could mean hours or days. I chose to use the time. I moved deeper, descending to levels I had never accessed during excavation work. The hive's foundations extended 7 kilometers below surface, built on sedimentary layers that had been compressed over millennia. Below that, natural cave systems existed, carved by ancient water flow that had ceased before humans arrived on this world. I descended into those caves, into darkness where my lamp was the only light, into silence where my breathing was the only sound. I existed there for 17 days. I know the duration precisely because I counted. There was nothing else to process. The brood mind was dead. I could not access the psychic network that had connected me to purpose since age 14. I was alone for the first time since I understood what alone meant. So I counted. Days, hours, minutes when the isolation became most difficult. I counted to maintain structure, to preserve some sense that I was still a mind capable of processing, rather than simply meat waiting for consumption. The isolation revealed things the brood mind had obscured. When consciousness connects to thousands of others constantly, individual thought becomes difficult. The network provided purpose, direction, certainty. Alone, those things dissolved. I was forced to examine what remained. I had killed for the cult. Not in combat only, but in targeted assassination. I had murdered Imperial officials who would have exposed our network. I had sabotaged equipment knowing the failures would kill workers who had no connection to cult or Imperium except the misfortune of their assignment. I had done these things without question because the brood mind carried them as necessary acts, as tactical requirements in service to greater purpose. Now, alone, I processed those acts as mine. Not the cult's, not the patriarch's. Mine. I had guided the blade, I had set the charges, I had pulled the trigger. The people I killed were dead because I chose to kill them. That I chose within a context of manipulation and genetic compulsion did not absolve the choice. I had possessed agency. I had exercised it. The blood was mine to carry. I thought about warning them, the Imperial citizens who would eventually discover what we had summoned. I could have broken cover at any point during the uprising, could have revealed the cult's true purpose to authorities who might have responded effectively. I had not. Not from inability, but from choice. I had wanted the star gods to come. I had believed we would be rewarded. I had helped deliver billions to consumption because I believed my faith made me special. It did not. Faith never does. Belief is not armor against consequence. It is simply the framework within which we contextualize our actions. I had believed in transformation and received consumption. The universe remained indifferent to what I believed it should provide. On day 17, the caves began to shake, not the specific frequency of unstable rock, but rhythmic vibration that suggested massive movement. The creatures had consumed the hive's surface and were working deeper, processing the infrastructure down to foundation. They would reach my depth eventually, perhaps hours, perhaps minutes. I considered remaining, letting consumption find me in the dark. It would be easier than climbing back to face what I had helped create, but ease had never been my purpose. I had spent my life in difficult spaces, cutting stone in tunnels that could collapse, fighting enemies who could kill me, existing in a system that measured my value in production output. I would not end by choosing ease. I climbed 7 kilometers of ascent through collapsed tunnels and unstable rock. The vibrations increased as I climbed, the sound of consumption growing louder. I emerged into what had been the hive's lower industrial sector and found it transformed. The buildings were gone. The streets were gone. The foundry where my mother had died was gone. Everything had been stripped to bedrock, the material broken down and absorbed. And everywhere, creatures moved through the devastation, processing the last remaining biomass. I saw other survivors, not many, perhaps 200 scattered across what had been a hive of 17 million. Some were cultists like me, fourth-generation hybrids who had hidden successfully. Some were Imperial citizens who had found shelter the creatures had not yet processed. They moved through the wasteland separately, not as groups. The social structures that created cooperation had dissolved. We were individual organisms attempting to extend our existence by hours or days. I encountered one other survivor I recognized, Tertius, a neophyte from my original cell, younger than me by 2 years. He was sitting on exposed bedrock, staring at the sky. The sky was wrong. The atmospheric processes that maintained breathable air had been consumed. The sky was turning red as oxygen levels decreased and particulate from the consumption process filled the atmosphere. I sat beside Tertius. Neither of us spoke immediately. There was nothing to say that we did not already know. We had succeeded completely in our mission. We had delivered the planet to the star gods. Our reward was death. Slow death from atmospheric degradation if the creatures did not find us first. Fast death when they did. Tertius asked if I had felt the Patriarch die. I confirmed that I had. He asked if I believed we would be judged by the Emperor after death. I told him I did not know. The Emperor had never spoken to me. The Patriarch had. The Patriarch had filled my mind with certainty and purpose and love. And the Patriarch had been wrong about everything that mattered. Tertius said he missed the broodmind. Even knowing what we knew now, even understanding that our faith had been suicidal, he missed the connection. Being alone was harder than dying. I agreed with him. I did miss it. The constant presence of other minds, the certainty that I was part of something larger, the knowledge that I would be remembered. Alone, I was simply meat waiting to be processed. One more component in the machinery of consumption. We sat together for 4 hours. Then the creatures found us. They came from multiple directions, mid-sized organisms moving with coordinated purpose. Tertius did not run. He had decided, and I respected that decision. He stood and opened his arms as Magnus had done, not in faith, but in acceptance. The creature killed him quickly. I watched, logging the details because witnessing was all I could provide. Then I ran again. Not from hope of survival, from stubborn refusal to make it easy for them. They had consumed my world, my family, my faith. They would not consume me without effort. I survived another 6 days. I do not know how. The hive was stripped to bedrock. The atmosphere was degrading hourly. Water sources were contaminated with biological residue. I existed in a state between consciousness and delirium, moving through wasteland because stopping meant immediate consumption. On day 6, I found the bioship. Not the massive vessel I had first witnessed, but a smaller organism, perhaps 200 meters in length. It had embedded itself in what had been the hive's foundation, its living structure extending into the rock. And it was producing. Organisms emerged from orifices along its flanks, fully formed creatures that immediately joined the consumption. The bioship was a factory, converting biomass into more consumers, perpetuating the cycle. I understood then. This was the purpose, not transformation, not uplift, simply endless consumption and reproduction. The hive fleet would strip this world to bedrock, absorb every gram of biological and chemical resource, and use that material to produce more ships and more creatures to consume more worlds. We had been part of that cycle. Not special, not chosen, simply biomass that had helpfully packaged itself and eliminated defensive resistance. I laughed. The sound was inappropriate given my circumstances, but I could not prevent it. 4 generations of faith, hundreds of years of careful genetic planning, 50,000 cultists dead in the consumption. All of it to make the hive fleet's work easier. We had been the most successful servants in Imperial history, and our masters had not even noticed we existed as individuals. The creatures found me while I laughed. Perhaps the sound attracted them. Perhaps they had been tracking me, and this was simply the moment of interception. 3 organisms, mid-sized, moving with coordinated purpose. They approached from different vectors, cutting off escape routes with practiced efficiency. I raised my autogun, 30 rounds. 3 targets. The mathematics were poor, but I fired anyway. Not from hope of survival. From spite. from stubborn insistence that I had existed as something more than biomass to be processed. I aimed for sensory organs and joint structures, targeting weak points Kale had taught me to recognize. I killed one. 27 rounds expended, precision shots to sensory clusters that caused the creature to thrash and collapse. The other two adapted, moving in patterns that prevented optimal targeting. I emptied the magazine into the nearest organism, causing damage but not stopping it. Then the autogun clicked empty. The creatures paused. Not from mercy. They were assessing threat level. I was unarmed, non-optimal biomass, damaged and depleted. They would consume me, but the pause suggested they were calculating priority against other available targets. I used the pause to speak. Not to them. They could not understand human language and would not care if they could. I spoke for the record, for the possibility that someone would eventually find this place and attempt to understand what occurred. I said, "We succeeded. We delivered the world. Our faith was absolute. We were wrong about everything. The star gods do not love. They do not recognize. They simply consume. If anyone finds this testimony, understand. The Genestealer cults are not rebellion against the Imperium. They are suicide pacts we do not recognize as such. We birth ourselves into service to our own consumption. We are the Imperium's lesson written in genetic code. Faith without evidence leads only to death. Ours, yours, everyone's who believes they are chosen." The creatures moved. Blade limbs punched through my chest and abdomen, precise strikes that avoided immediate death but ensured immobility. I felt my body fail, systems shutting down in sequence. The pain was significant but manageable. I had lived with pain since age 10, working in tunnels that broke bodies. This was simply more of the same. As consciousness degraded, I thought about my mother, about her geometric scars and chemical smell, about the 6 years she survived in a sector with 14% annual mortality, about the faith she carried in her cells that her son would be saved from the grinding machinery of imperial existence. She had been wrong, but she had tried. In a universe that provides no certainty and no comfort, she had tried to give me purpose. That effort mattered, even if the purpose was false. She had loved me in the only way her compromised mind could conceptualize love. I forgive her. I hope someone forgives me. The creatures began feeding. I felt it, consciousness persisting as they broke down tissue and absorbed nutrients. I existed as distributed process, awareness fragmenting across dissolving neural pathways. I tried to count the seconds, to maintain structure until the final moment, but the numbers would not cohere. My last thought was not profound. It was simple arithmetic. 4 generations multiplied by average generation span, multiplied by cult population. Approximately 130 years and 50,000 lives. All consumed, all forgotten, all meaningless in the calculus of the Hive Fleet's hunger. The mathematics suggested we had never mattered, but I had mattered to Kale. He had mattered to me. My mother had mattered in her failed attempt to save me. Magnus had mattered in his certainty even as it killed him. We had been wrong about salvation, but we had been real in our connections. That would have to be sufficient. I do not exist now in any form that can be called alive. This testimony is reconstruction, memory processed through degraded neural pathways as they dissolved. I do not know if anyone will find this record. I do not know if anyone will care. But I have witnessed, I have testified. The Genestealer cult of Salvation's Edge succeeded completely in every objective. We infiltrated the government. We called the Hive Fleet. We delivered the world to our star gods. Our reward was exactly what we deserved. What anyone who mistakes consumption for love deserves. We became what we served. We were eaten. We died, confused, and betrayed and certain we had been chosen for something better. We were not chosen. We were tools. The universe uses tools until they break, then discards them for new tools. We broke. The universe did not notice. If you find this testimony, understand what the Genestealer cults truly are. Not rebellion, not transformation. Suicide dressed as faith. We birth ourselves into servitude to consumption and call it purpose. We are the Imperium's most perfect product. Citizens who believe their suffering means something, who work themselves to death for promises of reward, who deliver themselves to consumption and call it salvation. We were wrong about the star gods, but we were right about one thing. The machinery that consumes us is indifferent to our suffering. Whether that machinery wears the Imperium's eagle or the High Fleet's hunger makes no difference. We are fuel. We are components. We are biomass to be processed. I existed. I witnessed. I am consumed. The cycle continues. It will always continue. Faith changes nothing. The machinery grinds on. This is my testimony. This is what happens when a Genestealer cult achieves their goal. We succeed. We die. We are forgotten. We never mattered, except to each other. And now we are all gone. The Emperor does not protect. The star gods do not love. There is only consumption. Choose what consumes you carefully. The choice is all you get. I am processed. I am archived. I am gone. Remember us. Or don't. The result is the same.